In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where the promise of modern medicine meets the shadows of ancient maladies, some wounds refuse the healing touch of conventional treatment. Tonight we continue the adventures of Detective Nathaniel Milbane and Victoria Pemberton as they seek help for an injury that defies rational explanation. This is Victorian Cthulhu. Episode 5, The Case of the Sanatorium's Secret. The early January morning carried the bite of winter through London streets, frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of the growler cab as it made its way through the fashionable district of Marylebone. Victoria Pemberton adjusted her muff nervously, stealing glances at Will Chester, who sat beside her with his injured arm resting carefully in his lap. Across from them, Nathaniel Milbane observed the passing streets with his characteristic analytical attention, though she noticed his occasional concerned looks toward their companion. "I still maintain this is unnecessary fuss," Will said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "It's merely a scratch that's taking its time to heal." "A scratch that's maintained the same peculiar shadowed appearance for nearly 3 weeks," Nathaniel replied firmly, "and one that clearly causes you more discomfort than you care to admit." Victoria watched Will's jaw tighten slightly, a small gesture that confirmed Nathaniel's observation. During their Christmas celebration with Will's family, she had noticed how he favoured his uninjured arm, though he had tried admirably to conceal his discomfort from his parents and siblings. The wound itself remained an unsettling sight, 4 parallel marks where the creature's claws had torn through his coat sleeve, each surrounded by a strange shadowed pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Dr. Harvey comes highly recommended," she offered diplomatically. "Professor Blackwood speaks very well of his treatment." "Edmund seems to speak highly of him in all regards," Nathaniel said with some thought. "I am very curious to meet this Dr. Alton Harvey." "Yes, well, the Professor's nightmares are hardly comparable to a few scratches," Will muttered, though he immediately looked contrite. "Forgive me, Miss Pemberton. I know you're both concerned, and I'm grateful for it." The growler drew to a halt before an immaculate Georgian townhouse, its black-painted door bearing a discreet brass plate that read, "Alton Therapy, Dr. A. Harvey, Physician." The building exuded quiet respectability, but its windows, spotless and dark, gave Victoria a brief sense of being watched from within. They were admitted by a silent manservant who led them through a tastefully appointed waiting room to Dr. Harvey's consulting chamber. The room itself had an understated elegance, rich burgundy wallpaper, heavy oak furniture, and shelves lined with medical texts and curious artifacts that spoke of travels in distant lands. A fire crackled warmly in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet, yet something about the symmetry of the room felt too deliberate, as if it had been arranged for observation rather than comfort. Dr. Alton Harvey was already on his feet as they entered, tall, sharply dressed, and so unnervingly still that Victoria momentarily wondered if he had been standing there for some time. His dark velvet suit fit impeccably, and a silver lorgnette hung from a fine chain, glinting as it caught the firelight. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, though something about his bearing suggested an ageless quality that made precise estimation difficult. His dark hair showed no trace of grey, and his pale eyes held an intensity that was both compelling and slightly unsettling. "Mr. Milbane, Miss Pemberton, Mr. Chester," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and refinement. "Professor Blackwood has spoken of you all with considerable respect." He moved with fluid grace as he approached them, his manner conveying both professional confidence and genuine interest. When he shook hands, Victoria noticed that his grip was perfectly firm, but left a chill on her palm that lingered longer than it should have. "Please, be seated," Dr. Harvey continued, gesturing to the comfortable chairs arranged before his desk. "I understand we have a medical mystery to examine." Will removed his coat with careful movements, rolling up his shirt sleeve to reveal the 4 parallel wounds. In the warm light of the consulting room, the strange shadowed quality of the surrounding skin was even more pronounced, creating an almost artistic pattern that seemed to shift subtly as one looked at it. Dr. Harvey approached with his lorgnette raised, studying the wounds with the focused attention of a scholar examining a particularly interesting manuscript. His examination was thorough but gentle, his fingers probing the edges of the marks with practiced skill. "Most intriguing," he murmured, almost to himself. He studied the wound with a calm, distant interest, as if it were an artifact in a museum rather than part of a living man. The tissue shows no signs of infection in the conventional sense, yet there's clearly something preventing normal healing. He paused, lowering his lorgnette to meet Will's eyes directly. "Tell me, Mr. Chester, do you experience any unusual dreams, sensations during sleep?" Will shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, actually. Strange dreams, though nothing as severe as what Professor Blackwood described." "And the pain, describe its quality for me." "It's not a sharp pain," Will said thoughtfully. "More like a persistent ache, as if something cold has settled into the bone. Sometimes it seems to pulse, particularly at night." Dr. Harvey nodded with evident satisfaction, as if Will's description confirmed some private theory. "Mr. Chester, your affliction is not unknown to me, though it rarely appears so distinct. This is not disease in the common sense, not bacterial, not inflamed." He tilted his head slightly. "It is." He paused, almost theatrically. "A disturbance." Victoria expected him to continue, to explain his words, but he did not. He returned to his desk, withdrawing an elegant card from a small wooden box. "I do not treat such cases directly. My practice lies in matters of the mind, nightmares, fugues, disassociations, but I know someone who may help." He handed the card to Will. "Dr. Septimus Reed, at Staplehurst Sanatorium, not far from Whitstable, a quiet facility. He has a remarkable record with cases that present peculiarities." Nathaniel leaned forward with interest. "What sort of specialized treatment does this involve?" "Dr. Reed has developed innovative approaches to conditions that manifest with both physical and what we might diplomatically call metaphysical symptoms," Dr. Harvey replied smoothly. "The seaside location provides an ideal environment for rest and recovery, while his particular expertise addresses the underlying causes that conventional medicine finds perplexing." Victoria noticed that Dr. Harvey's explanation, while delivered with apparent openness, somehow managed to reveal very little concrete information. There was something about his manner. He seemed confident and reassuring, and yet at the same time evasive and distant. "How long would such treatment require?" she asked. "Typically a few days of assessment and initial treatment, followed by periodic follow-up visits as needed. Dr. Reed's approach is quite thorough, but most patients find the results well worth the temporary inconvenience." Will examined the card Dr. Harvey had provided. The paper was of excellent quality, with Staplehurst Sanatorium embossed in elegant script, followed by an address near Whitstable in Kent. "I suppose a few days by the sea wouldn't be entirely unpleasant," Will said, though his tone suggested more resignation than enthusiasm. "Excellent," Dr. Harvey said, returning to his desk to write a brief note on his professional letterhead. "I'll provide Dr. Reed with a summary of my examination. The train service to Whitstable is quite reliable, and the sanatorium provides transport from the station." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Harvey paused at the door of his consulting room. "One small word of advice, Mr. Chester. Dr. Reed's methods may seem unconventional. I would encourage you to approach the treatment with an open mind. Some conditions require approaches that challenge our usual understanding of medical practice." They bid their goodbyes and returned to the frosty London street. "Well, things seem promising," Nathaniel said, as they settled into the growler, "though I confess I'm not entirely certain what we learned." "He certainly seemed confident about the diagnosis," Will observed, flexing his arm experimentally. "And he's clearly familiar with cases like mine, which is more than conventional doctors have been able to offer." Victoria remained quiet, watching the London streets pass by as they returned toward Bloomsbury. She couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that Dr. Harvey knew more about the wound than he had offered. "I have heard that the English seaside is quite charming. It may not be the season, but we should make a trip of it, don't you think, Uncle Nate?" The railway journey to Whitstable the following morning offered a welcome reprieve from the smoke and bustle of London. Their first-class compartment was quiet and comfortably heated, affording glimpses of the Kent countryside beneath a pale winter sky. Frost clung to the hedgerows, and snow lingered in shaded hollows where the sun never quite reached. Nathaniel sat with a slim volume of local folklore, reading in intervals. "It's remarkable how many coastal parishes claim some haunting or other," he said. "Smugglers, shipwrecks, ghosts by the dozen. The sea seems to invite legends." "Perhaps it's the sound it makes," said Victoria, watching the shifting landscape. "All that rhythmic roaring and whispering, like a great creature breathing just beneath the surface." Will, seated opposite, looked out through the glass. "I've had dreams lately," he said. "Not distressing exactly, just strange. Places that feel endless, and a kind of singing, like someone calling from very far away." Victoria and Nathaniel exchanged a glance. The imagery was all too familiar. Nathaniel's own experience with sleeping images was still fresh in his mind. "When did they begin?" Nathaniel asked. "Christmas Eve," Will replied. "I thought it was the holiday, but they've continued since. Always the same, great empty spaces, as if I'm lost in a cavern the size of the world. And that song, everywhere, but never quite close enough to hear clearly. Everything we do, everything we touch, seems to touch us back in our dreams. This really is worrying." Nathaniel had a look as bleak as the outside weather. "Well, dreams don't worry me one bit," Will declared, and then added, "Do you think the driver would let me ride in his cabin for a bit? I really do like steam trains." The train whistled as they approached the station. Waiting for them on the platform was a closed carriage drawn by a pair of grey horses. The driver, a middle-aged man with a curt nod, offered no more than basic pleasantries as he loaded their luggage and confirmed their destination. Whitstable itself was a quiet, prosperous town, its reputation for oysters still apparent in the painted signs and scent of salt in the streets. As the road turned seaward, the landscape opened into rough grassland, the smell of brine growing stronger. In the distance, the estuary glimmered beneath a brittle winter sky. Staplehurst Sanatorium stood upon a low cliff overlooking the water, a grey, angular structure built in the Gothic style, fashionable for institutions a generation prior. It was not ugly, exactly, but its architecture seemed to have been chosen for endurance rather than comfort. Ivy clung to the stonework, bare and brittle in the cold. Dr. Septimus Reed met them at the entrance. He was a lean man in his 40s, his hair already silvered at the temples, his posture impeccable. His manner was calm, earnest, almost reverent, and entirely unlike the urbane smoothness of Dr. Harvey. "Mr. Chester," he said, shaking Will's hand, "Dr. Harvey's note was very thorough. I believe we can be of assistance." He led them into a long carpeted hall lined with prints of the sea and pale coastal meadows. The sanatorium's interior was quiet and tastefully furnished, though something about its symmetry and stillness made the footsteps of their small group seem unusually loud. Dr. Reed's office occupied a corner on the first floor. The view was impressive, the estuary wide and pale, stretching toward the North Sea. The room itself was orderly and comfortable, with a fire burning low in the hearth. What caught Victoria's attention was the skull, perched prominently on the desk, not behind glass or cabinet, but resting openly, as if it were a paperweight. Its hollow eye sockets faced the door. Reed noticed her glance and smiled. "My apologies, she does tend to unsettle new visitors." He covered it gently with a dark cloth. Victoria said nothing. She wasn't entirely sure what response was appropriate. Dr. Reed examined Will's wound with clinical precision. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He leaned close, but said little until he had completed the inspection. "Yes," he said at last, "as I suspected, what we term a metaphysical taint. Cases like this are rare, but they are documented." "Taint?" Will echoed, his brow furrowing. "It refers to lingering influence. Not infection in the medical sense, but a lingering, an entanglement of energies the body cannot easily reject. Most conditions like this spread quite aggressively. You have a remarkably good constitution, Mr. Chester. Will grinned and winked at Victoria as the doctor continued his investigation of his arm. She made sure she suppressed her smile so as not to encourage any foolery. I've seen such things before. May I ask how the injury occurred? Will glanced at Victoria and Nathaniel, then chose his words carefully. We encountered a beast. The creature was disturbed, very aggressive and very unclean. I see, Reed said, nodding. Such wounds rarely heal of their own accord. We have methods here that address both the wound and its deeper resonance. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. What sort of methods? Rest, a controlled environment, certain therapeutic protocols tailored to the condition, most important of all, isolation from external noise and stimulus. At that moment, a woman appeared in the doorway, tall, severe, and dressed in the uniform of a senior nurse. This is Nurse Langley, Reed said. She'll be supervising Mr. Chester's treatment. Langley gave a crisp nod but said nothing. Room 14, Reed instructed. Standard metaphysical protocol. Yes, Doctor. Will rose reluctantly, collecting his bag. 3 to 5 days, you said? Typically, yes, though we'll assess day by day. Victoria lingered as he was led away. We'll return soon, she said quietly. Reed gave a courteous nod. He'll be well cared for. Will managed to smile as he turned. Don't fret, Miss Pemberton. Apart from me being bored to distraction, there is nothing to worry about. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. As the carriage carried them back towards Whitstable, Victoria looked once over her shoulder. Nurse Langley still stood in the doorway, perfectly still, hands folded before her like a statue in mourning. She shivered as the sea wind rocked the carriage, and the sound of mournful seagulls echoed over the cliffs. Whoever had told her the English seaside was charming had been remarkably misinformed. Will's room on the second floor of Staplehurst Sanatorium was modest but comfortable. A narrow bed, a small writing desk, and a window that offered a view of the sea, now dark and indistinct beneath the winter sky. The furnishings were plain, the air pleasantly warm, and the silence near total, a silence that, in time, became difficult to ignore. After a plain supper, taken in a quiet dining room with 2 silent fellow patients, Will returned to his room. He lit the lamp and examined the wound on his arm. The strange shadowed discoloration remained unchanged, though it pulsed faintly with an ache that had deepened as the day wore on. A soft knock broke the quiet. At the door stood a thin, nervous-looking man of about 35, his eyes darting like a bird's. He smiled, too wide, too quickly. "Evening," he said, and introduced himself as Elias Fairchild. "Room 7. Thought I'd come and say hello. Not many fresh arrivals this time of year." Will nodded and stepped aside. Elias entered with restless energy, took the room's single chair, and immediately began fidgeting with his sleeve. "Been here long?" Will asked. 3 weeks, Elias said, tone light but oddly hollow. "Brought in with something rather like your own condition, I expect." He rolled up his shirt to reveal a scar. Thin, pale, and faintly glassy in appearance, it shimmered slightly under the lamplight. "That there shadow, they call it taint," Elias said. "Not contagious, not treatable by your usual man with a thermometer. Dr. Reed, though, he's clever, works wonders." "In what way?" "I don't know how it works. He talks about channeling the energy out of me. He offered me a book to read about it, but I'm not a reader, so I just trust it will all work out." Will hesitated. "And you found it beneficial?" "Yes, sir, I have," Elias said with a weak brightness. "Had several treatments now, should be entirely done soon." The words landed strangely. Will wasn't sure why, but he shivered. Elias stood and paced a little. "Anyway, if you ever need anything, just ask. Or if you want something the hospital doesn't have, there's a chap in the laundry that will sneak it in like. Ask for Benny. Same if you want to write a letter or send word, unofficially, I mean." Unofficially? Dr. Reed prefers patients remain undisturbed during active treatment, Elias replied. Outside distractions can be unhelpful, apparently, but sometimes one needs to communicate. Will made a neutral sound, unsure whether he was being warned or offered a lifeline. One more thing, Elias added, pausing at the threshold. You may hear the doctor mention his mother. Don't let it trouble you. She's part of the process here. Will frowned. She works at the sanatorium? Elias's grin widened, but his eyes did not. In a manner of speaking, she's very involved, and extremely well versed in the sort of maladies we share. Quite old, of course, but still influential. With a little wave, Elias slipped out and closed the door behind him. The room felt colder after his departure. Will sat for some time, his arm now throbbing more deeply. The ache was spreading, not pain exactly, but a pulling sensation, hollow and insistent, as if something unseen were being drawn from him. It left him weary and oddly light-headed. He tried to distract himself with a book, then his journal, then pacing. Nothing helped. At length, hoping the movement might ease the sensation, he pulled on his dressing gown and stepped into the corridor. The sanatorium at night felt subtly changed. Gas lamps burned low. Shadows fell in long strips across the floorboards. The silence was now weighty rather than peaceful, broken only by the soft creak of the building settling. He passed the stairwell and paused. A sudden wave of dizziness struck him. He caught the wall, steadying himself, eyes blurred. The cold in his arms spiked, and for a moment it felt as though his breath had caught inside his ribs. The moment passed, but not entirely. He returned slowly toward his room, disturbed by the sensation, as though something had taken notice of him. As he passed room 7, he noticed there was no light under the door, no sounds. Elias, so animated and twitching before, seemed to have vanished into perfect silence. Back in his room, Will managed to undress and extinguish the lamp. Eventually, sleep came, and with it, dreams. He stood in a place without walls. The floor beneath him was stone, wet and immense, and the air hung heavy with salt and stillness. Ahead stretched vast arches, impossible in size, black as the sea. Somewhere distant, a voice sang, soft, wordless, beckoning. Was it a woman? Was it even human? Was it calling him? Will awoke to pale winter sunlight filtering through his window and the disquieting sense that something had altered in his arm, not healed, but changed. The shadowed discoloration around the wounds seemed darker now, more defined. When he flexed his fingers, they responded with a strange sluggishness, as though dulled by distance or cold. A soft knock interrupted his examination. Expecting Elias or Nurse Langley, he opened the door to find a sturdy young man in working clothes bearing a breakfast tray. "Morning, sir," the fellow said cheerfully. "Benny, laundry and errands. Thought you might appreciate a proper breakfast instead of the usual invalid mush." The tray bore eggs, toast, bacon, and unexpectedly strong coffee, far superior to what he'd expected from institutional fare. Benny, perhaps 25, had the calloused hands and direct manner of a man accustomed to honest work. "Elias said you might be someone who appreciates reliable service," he added, setting the tray down with practiced ease. "That's very kind of you," Will replied, watching him with cautious interest. "Elias mentioned to me you are a good man to ask if I need something." "Yes, sir. If you need anything, letters sent, supplies fetched, you've only to say. I've an arrangement or two in town, if you take my meaning." Will nodded slowly. Once alone, he decided to call upon Elias, partly to thank him, partly driven by a growing sense of unease. He knocked on the door to room 7. No answer. Trying the handle, he found it unlocked. The room was empty, thoroughly so, not just unoccupied, but reset. Bed freshly made, wash basin dry, no personal effects, no sign of previous habitation. It looked as though no one had slept there in weeks, not mere hours. Frowning, Will descended to the reception desk, where Nurse Langley was inspecting a stack of patient records. "Excuse me," he began, keeping his tone light. "I'm looking for Mr. Fairchild, Elias, from room 7. We spoke yesterday. I can't seem to find him." Langley looked up, her expression as composed as ever. "Mr. Fairchild was discharged late last night. His treatment was concluded. Dr. Reed declared him ready to resume ordinary life." "Discharged? Without warning? He said nothing of it to me yesterday evening." "Patients sometimes improve quickly under our care," she said evenly. "When recovery is complete, there is no benefit in delaying their return to normal routines." Her tone, though perfectly polite, was oddly mechanical, too smooth, too prepared. "Are you sure? When I spoke to him last night, he mentioned nothing to me at all." Nurse Langley's expression darkened considerably. "Mr. Chester, it is inappropriate to discuss other patients. I suggest you focus your energy on your own recovery." Will conjured his warmest and most disarming smile, but Nurse Langley's stone expression did not waver. "I'm sure you are right, nurse. I will inconvenience you no longer." Will spent the late morning wandering the sanatorium's grounds and public rooms. He asked a few porters if they had helped Elias leave in the night, but none offered him a helpful answer. The library was well stocked, the conservatory warm and filled with winter blooms, and the coastal garden afforded a bracing sea view. Yet a quiet dread had begun to cling to the place. The staff were courteous, but there was something oddly rehearsed in their manner, especially when the conversation strayed from routine. He encountered several patients, but none shared the symptoms he bore. Most were clearly convalescing from nervous exhaustion or melancholia. Their ills were of the mind, not the kind marked on the flesh. Will began to wonder whether he had been brought here for care or concealment. That evening, Benny reappeared with another tray. It contained a light meal and a laudanum tincture. "I wonder," Will said quietly, as Benny supervised him taking his medicine, "if you might deliver this to some friends? They are staying in Whitstable, just a brief message." He handed the porter a folded note and a coin. Benny pocketed both without hesitation. "Mail goes with tomorrow's run, sir. Consider it done." The note read simply, "Mr. Milbane, Miss Pemberton. Something strange happening here. Patient I spoke with yesterday has vanished. Staff say he was discharged, but it seems false. Return soon. Will." Determined not to sleep too soundly, Will positioned himself beside his door with the light low. Just before midnight, he heard the soft murmur of voices in the corridor, 2 men speaking outside his room in hushed urgency. He held his breath and leaned closer. His treatment isn't due. Why jump the queue? Started poking about. Dr. Reed said best not to wait. What if the morning staff ask questions? Cover stories ready, full recovery, discharged quietly, same as always. Their voices receded down the corridor, and Will's stomach knotted with dread. The sanitized state of Elias's room, Langley's evasions, none of it was routine. He resolved to remain awake, but the medication's effects were taking hold. His limbs grew heavy, his vision swam. Despite his efforts, his head drooped, and the last thing he saw was the indistinct shape of a gurney wheeled past his door. When next he roused, he was lying on a gurney himself, half supine and trundling through unfamiliar halls. His thoughts were muddled, his voice uncooperative. He tried to move, to sit up, but his muscles responded sluggishly. Above him, the gaslights flickered across vaulted ceilings he didn't recognize. As the dark closed in again, only one thought remained coherent. Whatever befell Elias Fairchild is now happening to me. Will's return to consciousness was slow and troubling. He felt the constraints first, soft but secure bindings around his wrists and ankles, pinning him to what he quickly realized was a surgical table. His head throbbed dully, and the ache in his arm had deepened into a strange, penetrating cold. The chamber around him bore no resemblance to the rest of Staplehurst Sanatorium. The stone walls were raw and damp, the vaulted ceiling low and oppressive. The air smelled faintly of brine, disinfectant, and something older. Gas lamps hissed along the walls, casting harsh light and deep shadows across the medical instruments and arcane apparatus laid out nearby. Dr. Reed stood over him, hands clasped behind his back, flanked by Nurse Langley and two silent, heavy-set orderlies. Despite the chilling surroundings, his tone remained polite, even warm. "Mr. Chester," he said, "awake at last, I'm pleased. We must begin at once." Will managed a hoarse whisper. "Begin what?" "Your treatment," Reed replied calmly. "The process I spoke of, though perhaps in more euphemistic terms. It is time to remove the source of your ailment." He nodded to Nurse Langley, who approached with a wheeled tray bearing several oddly shaped instruments and, most notably, the same skull Will had seen on Reed's desk. It now rested on a stand of wrought iron, and in this harsh light its hollow eyes seemed deeper, almost aware. "My mother, Lavinia," Reed explained, lifting the skull with something like reverence. "She believed that, through the taint, the soul could be distilled and purified." She was quite right. Will struggled against the bindings, but they held fast. The cold ache in his arm flared as Nurse Langley moved the skull closer, aligning it near the wound. She began to attach brass coils to both the skull and to a device that Will now noticed was attached to his arm. Reed continued, utterly serene. "This procedure will rid you of the metaphysical infection, a painless process, in theory, and, I must say, your condition has made you an ideal candidate." A knock echoed from somewhere above. One of the orderlies leaned down to speak quietly to Reed, whose eyes narrowed. After a moment's hesitation, he sighed. "How tiresome," he muttered. "I'm required upstairs. Nurse Langley, continue the preliminary phase. I shall return momentarily." Reed swept from the room with evident irritation. The moment he was gone, Langley's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder beneath. "Begin resonance alignment," she instructed the orderlies. "Let's see if Mother's hungry." They adjusted the skull's apparatus into position above Will's wound. A humming began, a low, vibrating tone, not from any machine, but from the skull itself. The shadows deepened in the sockets, a cold radiance forming within. Will gasped as a sharp, icy pull surged through his arm. At first, the sensation was oddly relieving. The pain and pressure receded. Before his eyes, the gashes began to close, the grey pallor fading. Flesh knitted with unnatural speed, the skin smoothing over almost perfectly. Langley observed with clinical detachment, "The healing is proceeding well." But the process did not stop. As the wounds sealed, Will felt something else being drawn out, deeper than blood or flesh. A strange numbness spread from the healed limb across his chest and into his thoughts. The world seemed to dim. He tried to cry out, but his voice caught. His fingers twitched uselessly against the restraints. "You'll feel a moment of weakness," Langley noted, adjusting dials on a brass panel connected to the stand, part of the process. But Will knew it was not simply weakness. Something was being stolen, something essential. With a final surge of adrenaline, he strained against the bonds. One wrist, already loosened during his earlier struggling, slipped free. He reached for the tray of instruments and seized a surgical mallet, swinging it clumsily at the stand. The skull wobbled. Langley shrieked. Will brought the mallet down again with desperate force. The apparatus toppled, crashing to the floor with a shattering crack. A faint moaning sound, not quite human, filled the chamber. The cold pressure in his chest lifted suddenly. "You idiot!" Langley snarled, lunging for him. Will threw the mallet at her and tore the remaining bindings loose. He staggered from the table, still woozy but free, grabbing a bone saw as the orderlies advanced. He slashed at the nearest one, buying seconds, and dashed for the door through which Reed had exited. Langley's voice echoed behind him, "Get Dr. Reed, now!" Will fled into the corridor beyond, the underground facility stretching into dim passageways he had never seen before. The light of the gas lamps flickered, and somewhere behind him heavy footsteps gave chase. But his arm was whole. Whatever dark process had taken place, it had worked, in part. He was no longer wounded, but what else had changed? And what had they meant about Lavinia still being hungry? Victoria Pemberton and Nathaniel Milbane arrived at Staplehurst Sanatorium in the early afternoon, their expressions taut with concern. The weather had turned foul since their last visit. Low clouds hung like a shroud over the coast, and a bitter sea wind lashed at them as they approached the sanatorium's doors. Inside, the atmosphere was stiflingly calm. A young nurse sat at the front desk with a ledger and pen, her manner brisk and formal. Nathaniel, whose patience had frayed during the carriage ride, stepped forward with authority. "We wish to speak with Dr. Reed immediately," he said. "It concerns one of your patients, William Chester." "I'm afraid Dr. Reed is engaged in a private consultation," the nurse replied without looking up. "He cannot be disturbed." Victoria leaned in. "We received a note from Mr. Chester. It was urgent." The nurse stiffened slightly, though her tone remained smooth. "Mr. Chester is under active treatment. I assure you he's in capable hands." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "Be that as it may, I insist." A tense pause followed before the nurse, evidently weighing the strength of Nathaniel's stance, rose and vanished through a side door. After several minutes, Dr. Reed himself appeared, his silver hair as immaculate as ever, but he showed obvious signs of irritation. "Miss Pemberton, Mr. Milbane," he said tersely, "I wasn't expecting you today." Nathaniel stepped forward. "We received a message from Mr. Chester. He feared for his safety. We're not here socially, Doctor." "I understand your concern," said Reed, nodding. "Come, we may speak in my office." He led them through to a comfortably appointed room on the first floor. Heavy bookshelves lined the walls, and the windows looked out across grey gardens and rough sea. Victoria took it in at a glance, then turned her attention to Reed. "We'd like to see Will." "That may not be advisable," said Reed. "He is undergoing a particularly delicate phase of his treatment. Any interruption may compromise his recovery." "With respect," said Victoria, "we didn't come all this way to take your word on that." Reed's lips thinned. "I assure you, Miss Pemberton, everything is proceeding according to plan." The conversation was cut short by a crash from somewhere below, followed by hurried footsteps and a raised voice calling Dr. Reed's name. His composure cracked for the briefest moment. "Excuse me," he said quickly. "There's a disturbance I must attend to." He swept from the room, leaving the door ajar behind him. Nathaniel waited half a heartbeat, then moved to the desk. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Something's wrong." Victoria was already scanning the bookshelves. Her eyes lit on a volume that protruded slightly from the others, a plain leather journal, its spine unlabelled. She pulled it free and opened it. "It's his handwriting," she said. "Listen to this. Day 847. Mother's responses are increasingly lucid. When nourished, she speaks, softly at first, but the voice grows clearer. She understands more of the artifact principle now. The seventh vessel draws nearer. Taint is the key." Nathaniel came to stand beside her. They turned pages together, each entry more unhinged than the last. Day 851. Subject Fairchild expired during the third phase of the ritual. A regrettable loss. He had been a cooperative vessel, but Mother absorbed nearly the full measure. Her skull pulses. She whispers. Day 852. The Chester specimen referred by Harvey exhibits a potent strain. Mother believes the convergence is close. Her essence must be anchored. Soon the seventh will awaken. Victoria stared at the page in horrified silence. He means to turn his mother into one of these artifacts, to give her some sort of permanent form through death. Nathaniel swallowed. And he's going to use Will to do it. Another loud noise from downstairs made the floor tremble. Shouting, the sound of running boots. Reed's voice echoed faintly through the walls, barking instructions. "They're dealing with him now," said Nathaniel grimly. "If we don't move, we might be too late." He tore a blank sheet from the desk blotter and stuffed it around the journal before slipping the bundle into his coat. Victoria had already crossed to the door. But their flight was forestalled. Two large men stepped into the doorway, orderlies, but not of the kind one saw delivering tea and blankets. "You need to remain here," said one, his voice flat as a chisel. Nathaniel straightened. "Actually, we were just leaving." "I don't think so," said the second. Before matters could turn to violence, another crash shook the building. A door slammed somewhere below, followed by shouting. The orderlies hesitated, just enough. "Go!" Nathaniel hissed. Victoria darted past them into the corridor. Nathaniel followed, brushing one man aside with surprising force. They sprinted toward the nearest stairwell, following the noise. Somewhere below, Will was fighting for his life, and they were his only hope. Following the sounds of conflict through the sanatorium's increasingly labyrinthine corridors, Victoria and Nathaniel discovered a concealed stairway that led to what appeared to be extensive underground facilities. The architecture here was older and more ominous than the main building, with stone walls that seemed to predate the sanatorium's Gothic revival construction. The passages were lit by gas fixtures that cast flickering shadows, creating an atmosphere that was decidedly more sinister than therapeutic. As they descended deeper into the underground complex, they could hear Dr. Reed's voice becoming clearer, though his words carried a ritualistic quality that was deeply unsettling. "Mother, we are so close," he was saying, his voice echoing through the stone corridors. "The Chester subject will provide everything you need for complete manifestation. Your years of patient waiting are nearly at an end." "Miss Pemberton," Nathaniel spoke with intensity, "I wonder, did you think to bring your derringer?" Victoria silently nodded. "Good," he continued, "we may need it." She pulled her gun from her small bag. Their previous supernatural encounters had taught them that conventional weapons might not be entirely effective against otherworldly threats, but they could certainly be useful against the human agents who served such forces. They followed a corridor that ended at a heavy wooden door. From beyond it came a low murmur of voices, rhythmic and purposeful. Peering through a narrow gap in the frame, Victoria and Nathaniel took in the chamber beyond. The room was square, cut from aged stone, and unnervingly clean. Along the walls stood an incongruous arrangement of equipment: surgical trolleys, sterilized trays, gas lamps, and tubes connected to strange brass instruments. Interspersed among them were objects far older, such as bowls carved from bone, black candles half melted into iron holders, and ancient markings daubed in a dark, flaking pigment. At the centre stood a wrought iron frame. Upon it rested the skull they had seen earlier in Dr. Reed's office. Here, it had been positioned with purpose, facing outward as if to witness the rite. The scene held a chilling clarity. Victoria leaned in. "That's her, Lavinia." Nathaniel nodded once. "This is madness, real true madness." Will, it appeared, had been subdued once more. He lay, restrained beneath the skull of Lavinia Reed, and a strange mist seemed to connect him to the ancient bone. Dr. Reed stood beside him, reading from an ancient-looking book while making gestures that seemed designed to direct the flow of spiritual energy. Nurse Langley was also present, along with another two ominous orderlies. "The final phase approaches," Dr. Reed intoned. "Mother, your essence grows stronger with each passing moment. Soon you will have sufficient energy to reclaim physical form." The skull itself seemed to pulse with a cold light that grew brighter as Will grew weaker. Most horrifying of all, Victoria could swear she heard something that might have been breathing coming from the preserved remains. "We have to stop this, now," she whispered to Nathaniel. He nodded, his expression determined despite such overwhelming opposition. "Do you have your gun?" "Yes," she replied, checking to ensure it was loaded and ready for use. "Then we go in together. Try to disrupt whatever process they're conducting while I attempt to free Will." They burst through the door simultaneously, Victoria's derringer trained on Dr. Reed, while Nathaniel rushed toward the apparatus holding Will. The sudden interruption caused immediate chaos in the ritualistic proceedings. "Stop!" Dr. Reed commanded, though his authority carried little weight against the two's determination. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. My mother's return is essential for—" Victoria's shot cut off his explanation, though she aimed deliberately wide of his position. The sound of gunfire in the confined stone chamber was deafening, and the echo seemed to continue far longer than physics should have allowed. The orderlies moved to intercept them, but Nathaniel had reached Will's position and was already working to free him from the restraints. The apparatus connecting Will to the skull sparked and hissed as its connections were severed, causing the cold light in the skull's sockets to flicker wildly. "No!" Dr. Reed screamed, abandoning his ritual book to rush toward the altar. "You're destroying years of work. Mother needs just a few more minutes." But his desperate intervention came too late. The disruption of the energy transfer caused something catastrophic to occur within the skull itself. Cracks appeared across its surface, spreading rapidly as the accumulated spiritual energy was released without proper control. The skull began to glow with intense light that was painful to look at directly, while a sound like screaming wind filled the chamber. Dr. Reed reached desperately toward his mother's remains, but the moment he touched the cracking bone, he convulsed as if struck by lightning. "Mother!" he cried out, but his voice was cut short as whatever force had been contained within the skull discharged itself through his body. He collapsed beside the altar, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror that mirrored the victims of his previous treatments. The skull itself crumbled to dust with a sound like breaking glass, leaving only empty space where the grotesque relic had dominated the chamber. The sudden silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the supernatural chaos that had preceded it. Nathaniel had successfully freed Will from his restraints, though their friend was barely conscious and showed obvious signs of severe weakness. "Can you walk?" Nathaniel asked urgently. "I think so," Will replied, though his voice was barely a whisper and he needed significant support to remain upright. Nurse Langley and the orderlies seemed stunned by the sudden collapse of their master's grand design. Without Dr. Reed's direction, they appeared uncertain about what action to take, but it was clear they would prefer to avoid any further confrontation with armed intruders. "We're leaving," Victoria announced firmly, keeping her weapon ready as they made their way toward the chamber's exit. "Anyone who tries to stop us will find themselves in a very unpleasant situation." The journey back through the underground corridors and up to the main level of the sanatorium was difficult, with Will requiring constant support and their group moving slowly enough that pursuit would have been possible. The sounds from below had created enough distress among the patients above that the staff above had their hands totally full. No one paid them any heed as they made their escape. Outside, the January afternoon had grown even colder, with snow beginning to fall from the grey sky. The driver who had brought them to the cliffside seemingly oblivious the chaos within. "Whitstable Station," Nathaniel instructed as they helped Will into the carriage, "as quickly as possible." They climbed aboard in silence. The Gothic façade of Staplehurst Sanatorium faded into the swirling snow behind them, and the truth of what had happened beneath its foundations remained buried, for now. The inn near Whitstable Station was quiet, its dark wooden beams and low ceilings giving the impression of a place untouched by time. Victoria had secured adjoining rooms on the upper floor, with a view of the snow-covered street and the grey sea beyond. It was simple but comfortable, more than adequate for a few days' rest, while Will recovered from his ordeal. He lay propped up in bed, pale but lucid, the strange pallor in his wounded arm now noticeably faded. Bandages had been applied with care, but beneath them the wound appeared to be healing in a way it never had before. "It's almost amusing," he murmured, examining the bandaged limb with detached curiosity. For all the horror of it, Reed's process did, partially, what nothing else could. "Reed's process nearly killed you," Victoria said crisply, handing him a cup of tea, "and it was designed to do far worse than that." "I'm not defending him," Will replied, "only observing the result. The wound is healing, and whatever metaphysical taint afflicted me seems to have lessened." Nathaniel, seated at the small writing desk, was leafing through the journal they had taken from Dr. Reed's office. While Will had convalesced, he had studied the book intently. His brow furrowed deeper with each passing page. "This isn't the work of a lunatic," he said eventually. "Not in the usual sense. It's systematic, measured. He charted every treatment, every subject. There are entries estimating spiritual yield from extractions. It's all there. Victoria, who had spent the morning arranging their return to London, joined them. He called his mother Lavinia the Unfinished. That phrase repeats again and again. She believed she was meant to become an artifact, but at her death the process was incomplete. Will looked up sharply. An artifact like the shard we found? Nathaniel nodded. Not just like it, exactly the same. First Lavinia and then her son were trying to create something to replace the one that is missing. The other 6 are referenced indirectly. Reed clearly believed them to be real. His mother was to be the 7th. But something failed. Victoria felt her mind trying to move the information around in her head, to join together different parts. Does the journal tell us more about these artifacts? What they do? What power they hold? Nathaniel spoke with pensive tones. Not much more than we know. The shard is mentioned, another is referred to as the key, and a third is mentioned as a chalice. These 3 were apparently brought to England after the expeditions were concluded. 3 more were taken to Boston. That seems to be their only reference. The search for the 7th was focused for a long time around Cairo, but eventually officially abandoned. Reed, however, writes here, "The search for the 7th continues, but things cannot be left to chance." It begins to ramble somewhat from there. "So we know then," mused Victoria, "that the artifacts are not all shards, as we first supposed. This is useful information indeed." "Yes," Nathaniel said quietly. "Professor Blackwood would be very excited by these notes." "Should we inform him, though?" Victoria looked worried, given his tendency to obsess over such materials. "You are right, we should keep this to ourselves for the moment. But for another reason also. Professor Blackwood led us to Dr. Harvey, and Harvey sent us to Reed. It is not clear to me how innocent Will's referral was to that hospital." Victoria gave a small gasp as she considered what Nathaniel was implying. "You think Harvey, or even the Professor, are complicit in Reed's plan?" Nathaniel's tone was firm. "I have grown fond of Edmund, but I am ruling nothing out at this point." Will frowned. "Does this plan of Lavinia's and Reed's even seem possible? These artifacts are ancient. Can such things be made?" "A question for Blackwood, perhaps," Nathaniel replied. "Though I suspect it was a fool's errand. Reed was ensnared by his own arrogance." "He described her as a vessel," Nathaniel continued. "Incomplete. He was using people, normal people, as fuel to finish what death interrupted." Will lay his head back on his pillow. He closed his eyes and spoke as if sharing his thoughts to the room itself. It was fascinating, though, to see how their machinery connected and functioned alongside such supernatural power. Imagine what amazing machines we could build. I wish I could have studied it further. Victoria, caught off guard by his excited tone, gave a small laugh. "Even while your spirit is being drained from your body, you were thinking of your machines." For a moment, silence fell between them. Outside, snow tapped gently against the window panes. "I keep thinking of Fairchild," Will said quietly. "He was trying to warn me, in his own way. I think he knew he was next." Victoria gazed out at the grey sky. "Our cases seemed isolated. They're not. There's a structure to them. A pattern." Nathaniel straightened. "I've written to a contact in London to make discreet inquiries into Reed's property and associates. If others are involved, I expect we'll find further threads to pull." Will let out a breath. "Then it's not over." "No," Victoria said. "There is much more to do." A knock at the door interrupted them. Just the innkeeper with extra blankets and a polite smile. After he'd gone, the trio sat in quiet reflection. Outside, the village remained still. The only sounds were the distant cries of gulls and the faint hiss of the wind sweeping in from the sea. It was a picturesque scene, utterly at odds with the horrors they had just escaped. And yet the shadow of what they had uncovered lingered. Not just the grotesque failure of Lavinia Reed's transformation, but the broader implications, artifacts scattered across England and beyond, a hidden network seeking to harness them, and the growing certainty that none of them were safe. "Sleep tonight," Nathaniel said at last, rising to pour himself a brandy. "We return to London tomorrow. Then we start uncovering the truth. Victoria slipped the journal into her satchel with quiet resolve. We're going to need answers. Will eased back against his pillows. Yes, and soon, he agreed. Outside, snow drifted steadily across the quiet streets of Whitstable, softening the world in a hush of white. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting unsteady shadows across the room. They were safe for the moment, but each of them understood the truth. What had happened at Staplehurst was part of a larger pattern, a creeping design that was only now beginning to show its shape. Sleep came eventually, deep and, at least for now, dreamless, while, beyond the window, the snow continued to fall. And so ends this tale of Victorian terror, where the promise of medical salvation can mask the darkest of intentions, and where those who seek to heal may harbour desires far more sinister than disease itself. Who knows what perils still await for our heroes to uncover? If you enjoyed this chilling tale, please give it a like. Likes, subscribes and comments will really help the channel, and it allows other lovers of dark horror to find us in the fog. Until then, sleep well and be wary of doctors who promise miracle cures.